Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little icy. Not the kind of icy that melts in your glass of water, but the kind of icy that lasted about half a century and kept two superpowers glaring at each other like awkward neighbors who refuse to trim their hedges. Yep, we're floating into the Cold War. So, get comfy. Lights dim, blanket tucked. Maybe you've got tea. Maybe you've got nothing but a stubborn pillow. Either way, this is not a story with loud explosions. Well, not directly. This is the kind of story where people stared across oceans, hoarded nuclear missiles, and argued endlessly about who had the better economic system, capitalism or communism. Spoiler, both sides managed to look kind of dysfunctional, while insisting they were the future of humanity. Let's set the stage. It's the end of World War II. Europe is basically one giant smoldering ruin. Cities like Berlin, Warsaw, and Stalingrad are rubble. Millions are displaced, millions more are dead, and everyone's traumatized. But, silver lining, two big winners emerge: the United States and the Soviet Union. One had booming factories, Hollywood, Coca-Cola, and jazz. The other had, well, Joseph Stalin, a whole lot of tanks, and an obsession with making communism look like the cool kids' table. Now here's the ironic twist. They had been allies, kind of, during the war. You know, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. America and the Soviets worked together to defeat Nazi Germany. Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin posed in those famous photos, smiling awkwardly as if they actually trusted each other. Spoiler again, they didn't. Those smiles were more "I'll stab you later" than best friends forever. By 1945, the war's over. Hitler is gone, Berlin is split, and Japan is about to get flattened by atomic bombs. The United States now has nuclear weapons. The Soviet Union doesn't yet, and that creates this weird, lopsided vibe. Imagine being in a poker game where one guy has a rocket launcher under the table. That's how Stalin felt, watching Truman casually drop nukes on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, almost like showing off a new gadget. So, what do you do when your ally demonstrates they can vaporize entire cities in seconds? Well, if you're Stalin, you clutch your pipe, scowl even harder than usual, and start planning your own bomb project. Because clearly, the Americans aren't going to stay friendly forever. Here's where the Cold War begins, subtly, almost sleepily. It's not about who has more friends or who throws better parties. It's about ideology. Capitalism versus communism. Private property versus collective farms. Freedom of speech versus freedom to disappear into Siberia. Each side saw itself as the savior of the world and the other as a dangerous disease. And of course, each thought it would win history. Humans really love believing history is some sort of championship game. But before we dive deeper into spies, nukes, and endless propaganda, let's linger a bit on the main characters. On the American side, you've got President Harry Truman. He wasn't exactly groomed to lead the free world. In fact, he was a former farmer and failed haberdasher. Yes, a men's clothing shop owner who went bankrupt. Suddenly, he's the guy in charge of nuclear policy. Talk about a glow-up. Truman was blunt, kind of cranky, and definitely not Roosevelt. He liked making big statements, like calling the Soviets out for not keeping promises about elections in Eastern Europe. He also liked dropping that whole "we have the bomb" vibe whenever possible. On the Soviet side, Joseph Stalin. He had been running the USSR since the 1920s, and by the end of the war, he was basically a dictator-king hybrid. Stalin was paranoid, ruthless, and very, very into controlling everything. He didn't just want to secure the Soviet Union's borders. He wanted a buffer zone of communist-friendly states stretching across Eastern Europe. Why? Because in his mind, everyone was out for him. Which, to be fair, wasn't entirely wrong. This brings us to one of the first big Cold War moments: Eastern Europe. After World War II, the Soviets occupied places like Poland, Hungary, Romania, and East Germany. And when I say occupied, I mean they rolled in with tanks and never really left. They set up governments loyal to Moscow, making sure communism spread like a very determined fungus. Meanwhile, the Americans were watching this and going, wait, that wasn't part of the deal. Churchill, by now retired from office but never retired from dramatic speeches, gave his famous Iron Curtain speech in 1946. He literally said an Iron Curtain had descended across Europe. Not an actual curtain, of course, though that might have been less stressful. This was the metaphorical wall separating East, Soviet control, from West, U.S. allies. So Europe became a divided stage. West Germany versus East Germany, NATO versus the Warsaw Pact, Coca-Cola versus state vodka. And the Cold War simmered from there. Let's pause and note the absurdity. Both sides had just finished fighting the deadliest war in history. Instead of taking a break, maybe breathing, maybe focusing on not starving their populations, they immediately dove into a half-century staring contest. Humans are nothing if not consistent. But before the nukes really started piling up, the first phase of the Cold War was about influence. Economic, political, cultural. America had the Marshall Plan, basically a giant money hose spraying dollars into Western Europe to rebuild economies. It wasn't pure charity. The U.S. figured happy, well-fed Europeans were less likely to vote for communists. And it worked. Western Europe recovered, and many people decided they liked consumer goods more than standing in bread lines. The Soviets, on the other hand, had their own system. They forced Eastern Europe into tightly controlled communist economies. Factories, farms, everything nationalized. Everyone's equal, except some were definitely more equal than others. And if you complained, hello, secret police. Hope you enjoy long winters in Siberia. Now, you might wonder, why didn't they just fight it out directly? I mean, they both had giant armies. The answer is nukes. Once the Soviets built their first atomic bomb in 1949, the game changed. Direct war between the U.S. and USSR meant mutual annihilation. So instead, they fought indirectly through proxy wars, propaganda, and endless competitions in space, sports, and basically everything humans could turn into a contest. But that's for later. For now, we're still in the late 1940s, where everyone's suspicious, nervous, and kind of pretending to be friends at international conferences while secretly plotting against each other. Let's float next into how the Cold War shaped daily life, because it wasn't just leaders and generals. Ordinary people suddenly found themselves in a world where children practiced duck and cover drills in case of nuclear attack, and neighbors wondered if their mailman was a communist spy. So, where were we? Right, children ducking under desks, Stalin glaring across maps, and Truman polishing his farmer-turned-world leader persona. Welcome to the late 1940s, when paranoia went mainstream. Because, let's be honest, the Cold War wasn't just tanks in Europe and politicians making speeches. It was also about spies in trench coats handing over microfilm in dark alleys. Or at least that's how the movies wanted everyone to picture it. Real espionage was usually less glamorous, more paperwork, coffee, and listening to static on radios. But still, it mattered. The Soviets had a whole spy network in the United States and Britain, quietly feeding Moscow information about the atomic bomb. And you know what? It worked. By 1949, the USSR had tested its own nuke way earlier than Washington expected. Turns out, Klaus Fuchs, a German-born scientist working on the Manhattan Project, was slipping secrets across. Imagine being the Americans, thinking you had this world-dominating weapon for decades, only to realize your enemies were already unpacking their own radioactive gift. Surprise! Meanwhile, the United States responded with a nationwide panic about communism at home. Enter McCarthyism. Senator Joseph McCarthy basically built his whole career out of pointing at random people and saying, "You're probably a communist." Hollywood actors, teachers, government clerks, no one were safe. The hearings were more theater than justice, but fear sells. People really believed communists were hiding in the PTA or maybe in their neighbor's lawn shed. Spoiler, most weren't. But while the West was busy accusing librarians of Marxist sympathies, the first big shooting war of the Cold War kicked off in Korea. Here's how it happened. After World War II, Korea was split at the 38th parallel. North Korea got the Soviets, South Korea got the Americans. Because, of course, what better way to liberate a country than to chop it in half? In 1950, North Korea, backed by the Soviets and later China, invaded the South. Cue 3 years of brutal fighting. The U.S. sent troops, the UN waved its flag, China poured in volunteers, and millions of Koreans got caught in the middle. Now here's the kicker. After all that bloodshed, destruction, and endless stalemates, the war ended in basically the exact same place it started. The border barely moved. The result? A frozen conflict that technically never ended. To this day, North and South Korea are still glaring at each other across the DMZ, which is, fun fact, one of the most heavily guarded borders on Earth. The Cold War was important, though. It set the tone. It proved that while the US and USSR wouldn't nuke each other directly, they had no problem turning other countries into battlegrounds. Proxy wars became the Cold War's favorite hobby. But let's step away from war for a moment, because there was also a cultural Cold War going on. America rolled out jazz, Hollywood movies, blue jeans, and Coca-Cola as symbols of freedom. The Soviets rolled out ballet, chess champions, and endless parades of tanks in Red Square. Both sides loved to show off. Propaganda was everywhere. In the U.S., children watched cartoons where communists were villains. In the USSR, posters show heroic workers building socialism while evil capitalist fat cats counted money. Neither side was subtle. Imagine trying to sleep in a world where your TV insists the other side is brainwashing you, while ironically, your own side is also brainwashing you. That's the Cold War in a nutshell. And then, just to spice things up, in 1953, both leaders changed. Stalin died, finally, after 30 years of paranoia and purges. His death wasn't peaceful either. He collapsed at his dacha, and his guards were too scared to bother him for hours. The man literally lay dying because no one dared interrupt him. Very on brand. In his place, Khrushchev eventually rose to power. Khrushchev was loud, impulsive, and famously banged his shoe on a desk at the United Nations. Compared to Stalin's icy paranoia, Khrushchev was almost cartoonish. But he also wanted to prove that the Soviet Union could compete with America, militarily, technologically, and ideologically. On the American side, Truman gave way to Ike Eisenhower, the former World War II general. Ike was calm, steady, and played a lot of golf. He didn't like hysteria, but he also wasn't about to let communism spread unchecked. His administration leaned on the policy of containment. Don't fight the Soviets everywhere, just make sure their influence doesn't spread further. Simple in theory, messy in practice. Meanwhile, the nuclear arms race was heating up, literally. Both sides built hydrogen bombs, weapons far deadlier than the ones dropped on Japan. Suddenly, the world had enough nuclear power to destroy civilization several times over. And yet, life went on. Children went to school. People bought cars. Suburban neighborhoods spread. It was as if everyone agreed to just live under the quiet background noise of possible annihilation. Of course, some people dealt with it by building fallout shelters in their backyards. Others stocked canned beans and thought they'd ride out World War III underground. Not the most relaxing way to live, but hey, at least you'd have beans. So, by the mid-1950s, the Cold War had its rhythm. Proxy wars, nuclear buildup, ideological propaganda, and constant suspicion. And yet, both sides were also locked together, like two boxers in a ring who didn't really want to throw the first knockout punch. Let's drift now into the next chapter, how the Cold War moved from Earth into space, because apparently staring at each other across Europe wasn't enough. They had to take the competition into orbit. So picture this. It's the 1950s. Life in America is all poodle skirts, diners, and Elvis mumbling into microphones. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, is rebuilding from World War II with giant concrete blocks, endless parades, and Khrushchev shouting about grain production. Everyone's already on edge with nuclear weapons, proxy wars, and propaganda. And then the Soviets casually lob a shiny metal ball into orbit. That ball was Sputnik 1, launched in October 1957. It was about the size of a beach ball, it beeped, and it circled the Earth. That's it. Nothing fancy, just a little satellite making circles. But in the United States, people lost their minds. Suddenly, newspapers screamed about Soviet superiority. Schools panicked about falling behind in science, and parents wondered if that tiny beeping ball was spying on them from above. It wasn't. But paranoia doesn't need facts. Sputnik triggered what became known as the space race. The Cold War was no longer confined to land, sea, or even nuclear stockpiles. Now, prestige meant rockets, satellites, and eventually, humans floating around in bulky suits. The irony here is pretty thick. The Soviets weren't exactly known for luxury or consumer culture. People stood in bread lines, shoes fell apart after a season, and refrigerators were scarce. But somehow, they beat America into space. Why? Because their rocket program, led by Sergei Korolev, was secretly one of the most advanced in the world. Of course, the Soviet people didn't even know his name. He was just called the chief designer. Only after his death did anyone find out who he actually was. Nothing like a little anonymity to keep things humble. Now, Americans weren't about to just shrug. In response to Sputnik, they created NASA in 1958. Suddenly, science classes got serious, and kids who might have been coasting through arithmetic were now learning about orbital mechanics. Textbooks became Cold War weapons. Nothing says national panic quite like making millions of 12-year-olds memorize equations. The Soviets weren't done, though. In 1961, they launched Yuri Gagarin into orbit, first human in space. Imagine being John F. Kennedy, the shiny new U.S. president, and realizing the Soviets just sent a guy to float around the planet while your own program was still fumbling rockets into the ocean. Not a great look. Gagarin, by the way, became a global celebrity overnight. He smiled, waved, and represented Soviet triumph. Back home, though, his life was less glamorous. He got shuffled around as a propaganda symbol, and his flying career was basically grounded. The Soviets didn't want to risk their space hero dying in a plane crash, which, spoiler alert, he eventually did in 1968. Irony has no chill. Meanwhile, Kennedy wasn't one to back down. In 1961, he gave his famous "We choose to go to the moon" speech, which, translated, meant, "Fine, Khrushchev, you can have Earth orbit, we're going for the big prize." And just like that, the United States committed to landing a man on the moon before the decade ended. Ambitious, expensive, and fueled by Cold War pride. The 1960s became a back and forth of space firsts. Soviets launched the first woman, Valentina Tereshkova, into orbit in 1963. Americans countered with increasingly complex missions under Mercury, Gemini, and finally, Apollo. Each launch was less about science and more about flexing in front of the other guy. Space became the world's most expensive bragging rights contest. And let's not forget Khrushchev's antics. He loved showing off Soviet rockets, sometimes exaggerating how many they actually had. In reality, Soviet missile technology wasn't as overwhelming as it looked, but perception mattered more than math. Nothing makes Americans open their wallets faster than the fear of falling behind. By 1969, the space race reached its climax. The United States landed Apollo 11 on the moon. Neil Armstrong stepped down, delivered his calm little line about one small step, and America officially declared victory. The Soviets never made it. Their moon program was plagued with exploding rockets and bureaucratic disasters. For all their early wins, they couldn't close the deal. But here's the twist. Did this monumental achievement change the Cold War? Not really. Sure, the U.S. got a giant morale boost and some amazing moon rocks, but the arms race, proxy wars, and political tension just kept rolling along. Because at the end of the day, standing on lunar dust didn't stop tanks in Vietnam or nuclear missiles in Cuba. Still, for ordinary people, the space race was a kind of cosmic distraction. Instead of thinking about annihilation, you could think about astronauts floating around and cosmonauts waving at the stars, a slightly more uplifting bedtime story, if you ignored the price tags and the occasional fiery explosion. Now, while space was making headlines, the Cold War was also heating up closer to home. Because, you see, when you mix nukes with Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida, you get one of the most famous almost ended the world moments in history. But before we dive into the Cuban Missile Crisis, let's drift slowly through the 1960s atmosphere. Civil rights movements in the U.S., decolonization across Africa and Asia, and superpowers sniffing around every new nation like rival dogs marking territory. Because the Cold War wasn't just East versus West anymore. It was global, reaching into every continent. So, it's the early 1960s. The Cold War has already given us spies, nukes, and space bragging rights. America is strutting around with Kennedy's moon speech, while Khrushchev is busy pretending Soviet missile stockpiles are way bigger than they actually are. Everyone's on edge. And then, Cuba enters the chat. Now, Cuba wasn't exactly supposed to be the star of the Cold War. It was just an island in the Caribbean, known for sugar, beaches, and being a vacation spot for wealthy Americans. But in 1959, Fidel Castro rolled in with his revolution, overthrew the old regime, and decided communism was the vibe. Suddenly, there's a Marxist government sitting just 90 miles from Florida. Imagine the U.S. reaction. It was basically absolutely not. Washington tried to play it cool. Sort of. First, they slapped Cuba with sanctions. Then they encouraged Cuban exiles to overthrow Castro. This led to the famous Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961. Spoiler, it was a disaster. A bunch of poorly supported exiles landed expecting the Cuban people to rise up against Castro. Instead, they got captured on the beach, and Castro got to pose as the heroic defender of the revolution. Kennedy, who had only just taken office, looked like a rookie, not America's best moment. And here's where the Soviets saw an opportunity. Khrushchev thought, hey, what if we stick some nuclear missiles in Cuba? That'll balance out the U.S. having missiles in Turkey and Italy. It was Cold War logic at its finest. Basically, you point nukes at us, we'll point nukes at you, but closer. So, in 1962, the Soviets secretly started shipping nuclear missiles to Cuba. They built launch sites. They thought maybe the Americans wouldn't notice, except, of course, American spy planes were constantly photographing everything. In October, U-2 reconnaissance flights captured clear images of missile sites being built. Cue panic in Washington. This led to what we now call the Cuban Missile Crisis. 13 days where the world collectively clenched. Kennedy and his advisors debated endlessly, airstrikes, invasion, or something else. In the end, Kennedy chose a quarantine, basically a naval blockade around Cuba to stop more Soviet ships from delivering missiles. And so began the most awkward staring contest of the Cold War. Soviet ships sailed toward the blockade, U.S. warships waited. Everyone held their breath. Meanwhile, Kennedy and Khrushchev sent each other increasingly dramatic letters. Some were calm and almost reasonable. Others read like late-night texts you regret in the morning. For ordinary people, this was peak anxiety. Kids practiced duck and cover drills, adults stocked canned food. Some genuinely thought World War III was about to start. After all, both sides had enough nukes to destroy civilization multiple times over. And here they were, daring each other to blink. Finally, on October 28th, Khrushchev backed down. The Soviets agreed to remove their missiles from Cuba in exchange for an American promise not to invade the island. Secretly, the U.S. also agreed to remove its missiles from Turkey a few months later, but that part stayed quiet. Kennedy got to look like the cool-headed hero, and Khrushchev had to explain to his colleagues why he'd basically folded under pressure. Spoiler, it did not make him more popular back home. The Cuban Missile Crisis is remembered as the closest the world ever came to nuclear war. And the funny thing is, it could have gone horribly wrong at any moment. A miscommunication, a nervous submarine captain, a single itchy trigger finger, and we wouldn't be here having this bedtime chat. Comforting thought, right? But let's step back for a second. The crisis also led to a few surprisingly positive outcomes. Both sides realized maybe, just maybe, constantly dancing on the edge of nuclear war was a bit much. In 1963, they set up the famous hotline between Washington and Moscow, a direct phone link so leaders could talk quickly in case of emergencies. No more waiting for telegrams while the world sweated. They also signed the Limited Test Ban Treaty, stopping nuclear tests in the atmosphere, because apparently filling the skies with radiation wasn't great for public health. Who knew? So, the missile crisis passed, the world breathed again, and Castro stayed in power. Smugly, of course. He outlasted both Kennedy and Khrushchev, which is kind of impressive, considering how many times the CIA tried to get rid of him. The number of assassination plots involving exploding cigars and poisoned wetsuits is almost comical if it weren't so grim. From here, the Cold War didn't calm down exactly, but it shifted. The 1960s and 70s became about Vietnam, détente, and the idea that maybe endless confrontation was exhausting. Spoiler again, it was. But don't worry, we'll get there slowly. For now, let's just float out of 1962 with the image of Khrushchev writing frantic letters, Kennedy pacing with his advisors, and the world quietly realizing it had narrowly avoided becoming one big radioactive parking lot. Comforting thought, right? So, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, both Washington and Moscow took a deep breath. Everyone realized that pushing nuclear buttons wasn't exactly sustainable. But here's the thing. Just because the superpowers weren't lobbing nukes at each other didn't mean they stopped competing. They just outsourced it. And nowhere did that outsourcing look more chaotic than in Vietnam. Let's rewind a little. Vietnam had been a French colony, and after World War II, it wanted independence. Cue Ho Chi Minh, a communist leader who had this wild idea that his country should govern itself. The French, not thrilled, tried to hang on, and things got messy. By the mid-1950s, the French gave up after getting thoroughly defeated at Dien Bien Phu. But instead of letting Vietnam reunite, the Cold War swooped in. The country was split. North Vietnam went communist under Ho Chi Minh, while the South was backed by the United States, which apparently had made it a personal mission to stop communism anywhere, even if it meant sweating through jungles. At first, America just sent advisors and money. But, predictably, it escalated. By the 1960s, under Presidents Kennedy and then Lyndon B. Johnson, U.S. troops were pouring in by the hundreds of thousands. Officially, the mission was to contain communism. Unofficially, it became a slow-motion disaster. The Vietnam War was brutal, confusing, and deeply unpopular back home. The U.S. dropped more bombs on Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia than were dropped during all of World War II. Napalm, Agent Orange, endless firefights. It was a nightmare for civilians and soldiers alike. And for what? The North Vietnamese and their southern allies, the Viet Cong, refused to quit. They fought on, dug tunnels, and made it clear they weren't going anywhere. Meanwhile, back in America, protests exploded. College campuses filled with anti-war demonstrations. Draft dodging became a national pastime. Musicians strummed guitars about peace. Johnson, overwhelmed and unpopular, eventually stepped aside in 1968. Nixon stepped in, promising peace with honor. Spoiler, it was neither peaceful nor particularly honorable. Nixon escalated bombing campaigns, invaded Cambodia, and then slowly started pulling U.S. troops out. By 1973, after endless negotiations, a ceasefire was signed. 2 years later, North Vietnam rolled into Saigon anyway, uniting the country under communism. Decades of American effort, countless lives lost, billions of dollars spent, all ending in a helicopter airlifting people off a rooftop. Not exactly the victory Washington had dreamed of. For the Soviets, Vietnam was a win. They got to support a communist ally, watch America flail, and look smug in the process. But the cost for Vietnam itself was catastrophic. Millions dead, cities destroyed, farmland poisoned. It was the human side of the Cold War, where superpower rivalries left smaller nations in ruins. But let's not linger too much in the mud and fire, because oddly enough, the late 1960s and 1970s also brought a strange word into Cold War vocabulary, détente, which is just a fancy French way of saying, let's chill a little. Nixon, despite his paranoia and love of tape recorders, pulled off one surprising move. He visited China in 1972. Yes, communist China. Up until then, Beijing and Washington basically ignored each other. But Nixon, ever the strategist, decided opening relations with China could pressure the Soviets. It worked. Suddenly, the Cold War wasn't just two-sided anymore. It was a triangle. US, USSR, and China all circling each other. At the same time, Nixon and Brezhnev signed arms control agreements, like the SALT treaties, limiting nuclear weapons. They also agreed on trade deals. Brezhnev even visited the United States, where he drove around in a Lincoln Continental and pretended to enjoy American hot dogs. The photo ops were strange, but effective. For a brief moment, it looked like the Cold War might soften. But détente was never exactly warm and fuzzy. Behind the handshakes, both sides kept building weapons, kept spying, and kept influencing wars in Africa, the Middle East, and beyond. It was like two roommates agreeing not to argue while still leaving passive-aggressive notes on the fridge. Still, détente gave the world a small breather. Less nuclear panic, more dialogue. And it set the stage for the 1970s, a decade of disco, oil crises, and superpowers pretending they were mellow while secretly plotting their next moves. But before we drift too far, let's pause here. The Cold War by the mid-1970s had already spanned 3 decades. Leaders had come and gone, wars had burned hot, and yet the core tension remained. Two systems, two ideologies, staring each other down. Capitalism versus communism. Freedom fries versus collective farms. Neither side was giving in. And soon enough, détente would crack. The late 1970s and 1980s would bring a new round of tension. Afghanistan, Reagan, and a second Cold War chill that made the first one look almost relaxed.
So, détente. That nice, polite, let's be reasonable phase of the Cold War. It looked promising in the 1970s. Handshakes, trade, treaties, Brezhnev looking unusually cheerful while eating American corn on the cob. But like most fragile truces, it didn't last. Because by the late 1970s, the world was about to get chilly again. The turning point? Afghanistan. In December 1979, the Soviet Union rolled tanks into Afghanistan. The official excuse was to support a friendly government. The reality was messier. The Afghan communist regime was unstable, deeply unpopular, and losing control. So, naturally, Moscow thought sending in thousands of troops would fix it. Spoiler, it didn't. Instead, the Soviet invasion turned into their version of Vietnam, a long, bloody war they could never win. Afghan rebels, known as the Mujahideen, resisted fiercely. And guess who started funding them? Yep, the United States. Along with Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, and a few other allies, Washington funneled money, weapons, and training into Afghanistan because nothing says Cold War like fighting your enemy indirectly by handing out rifles and missiles to local fighters. The result? A decade-long quagmire. Soviet soldiers slogged through mountains, ambushed at every turn, helicopters got blown out of the sky by U.S.-supplied Stinger missiles, casualties piled up, morale sank, and back home, Soviet citizens began to ask why their boys were dying in some faraway desert. Not a great look for a superpower already struggling with economic stagnation. Meanwhile, across the ocean, America got a new president in 1981, Ronald Reagan. And if détente had been all about cautious diplomacy, Reagan was not that. He came in with a Hollywood grin, a cowboy swagger, and a habit of calling the Soviet Union the evil empire. Subtlety was not his brand. Reagan's approach was simple: crank up the pressure. He boosted U.S. military spending massively, poured money into new weapons, and unveiled the famous Strategic Defense Initiative, better known as Star Wars. The idea was to build a space-based missile defense system that could shoot down incoming Soviet nukes with lasers and satellites. It sounded like science fiction, because it basically was. The technology didn't exist, but the announcement alone freaked out the Soviets, who suddenly imagined America building an invisible force field over itself. Reagan also doubled down on proxy conflicts. If there was a group fighting communists anywhere, chances were the CIA had a suitcase of cash nearby. Central America, Africa, the Middle East, pick a continent, and the Cold War had some kind of side project running there. The Soviets, under Brezhnev and then his short-lived successors, Andropov and Chernenko, tried to keep pace, but the strain was showing. Their economy was sluggish, their technology lagged, and Afghanistan was bleeding them dry. State-run shops were half empty. Citizens joked that under communism, everything was guaranteed, except food, freedom, and consumer goods. By the mid-1980s, a new Soviet leader emerged, Mikhail Gorbachev. Younger, reform-minded, and painfully aware that the USSR couldn't keep playing this expensive game forever. He introduced words like glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. Basically, maybe we should stop pretending everything's fine and actually fix stuff. At first, Reagan treated Gorbachev like just another Soviet opponent. But over time, the two found a weird kind of rapport. They held summits, signed arms reduction treaties, and even joked together on camera. Slowly, the ice began to thaw again. But we're not at the end yet. Before the Cold War collapsed, there would still be drama. Nuclear scares, Eastern Europe rumbling with change, and the Berlin Wall looming as the most famous symbol of division. For now, though, picture the 1980s as a strange mix. On one hand, mullets, cassette tapes, and neon fashion. On the other, nuclear arsenals, Afghan guerrilla fighters, and world leaders trading speeches about good versus evil. Because nothing says peaceful bedtime history like imagining Reagan grinning while Soviet soldiers wonder why they're stuck in Cuba.
So by the mid-1980s, the Soviet Union was basically running on fumes. They had the military hardware, sure, but their economy? Think of a car engine sputtering on watered-down gas. Stores were empty, people stood in lines for bread, and the black market was doing better business than the official state system. Not exactly the image of a triumphant superpower. Enter Mikhail Gorbachev. He took power in 1985 and immediately realized he had inherited a sinking ship. Instead of just repainting the deck, he tried something radical, actually reforming the system. He introduced perestroika, restructuring, to modernize the economy, and glasnost, openness, to allow more free speech, debate, and criticism.
Imagine suddenly going from decades of Soviet propaganda to people openly complaining about the government on TV. It was shocking. The problem? Once you let people criticize, they don't stop. Glasnost was supposed to make communism more honest. Instead, it revealed just how broken everything really was. People wanted more than bread and slogans. They wanted freedom. Meanwhile, over in Eastern Europe, the satellite states had been dutifully playing along with Moscow for decades. Poland, East Germany, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, these countries all had communist governments installed after World War II, and they all knew what happened if you stepped out of line. Hint, Soviet tanks. Lots of them. But by the late 1980s, Gorbachev quietly made it clear he wasn't going to keep sending tanks. The Soviet Union simply couldn't afford to babysit every corner of the empire anymore. And once the neighbors realized Moscow's iron grip was loosening, the whole bloc started to wobble. Poland moved first. The Solidarity movement, a mix of trade unions and political opposition, pushed hard for reforms. Against all odds, they were allowed to run in elections, and they actually won. Just like that, Poland began shifting away from communism. Hungary followed, opening its border with Austria. That one small decision created a flood of East Germans sneaking across, because if you wanted to escape East Germany, suddenly you had a back door. It was like poking a hole in a balloon. Once people saw a way out, they rushed for it. East Germany, though, was the big one. The Berlin Wall had stood since 1961, the ultimate symbol of the Cold War divide. Families split, guards with guns, concrete slabs separating two worlds. But by 1989, protests in East German cities grew larger every week. People chanted for freedom, not just better bread. The government tried to hold firm, but it was like plugging leaks in a dam with chewing gum. Then came the moment that nobody quite expected. In November 1989, a confused East German official gave a press conference, misread his notes, and basically announced that travel restrictions were being lifted immediately. Crowds rushed to the Berlin Wall. Border guards, overwhelmed and unsure, just let them through. People climbed the wall, cheered, and started chipping away at it with hammers. Years of Cold War symbolism crumbled under streetlights, piece by piece. It was surreal. For decades, the wall had been untouchable. Overnight, it became a souvenir. Germans walked through the holes, hugged family members they hadn't seen in decades, and partied on top of the very concrete that once divided them. And here's the thing, it wasn't just Germany. Across Eastern Europe, communist governments started collapsing like dominoes. Czechoslovakia had its Velvet Revolution. Romania saw its dictator, Ceausescu, toppled and executed, though in true sleepy history fashion, we'll glide past the gory details. One by one, the regimes fell, and suddenly half of Europe was shrugging off Moscow's shadow. For the Soviets, this was both humiliating and inevitable. Gorbachev wanted reform, not collapse. But once you pull out the nails, the whole house tends to fall down. By the end of 1989, the map of Europe was changing faster than anyone could keep up with. For the first time in decades, the Iron Curtain wasn't just cracking, it was dissolving. But wait, we're not done yet. Because while Eastern Europe was breaking free, the Soviet Union itself still had to deal with its own internal mess. Nationalism, economic chaos, and one man named Boris Yeltsin were about to finish the job. So let's dim the lights a little more, lean back, and drift into the final chapter of the Cold War.
So by 1990, it was clear the Cold War wasn't just cooling, it was basically running out of steam. Eastern Europe had peeled away. Germany was in the process of reunification. and the Soviet Union itself looked, well, shaky. Imagine a giant building with cracks running all through it, but everyone still pretending it's fine. Mikhail Gorbachev was still trying to hold things together with his reform programs. Perestroika was supposed to modernize the economy. Glasnost was supposed to keep people happy with openness. Instead, they exposed decades of problems. People wanted freedom, not just transparency. And local nationalist movements wanted independence, not just better communism. The Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia were among the first to openly demand independence. These tiny nations had been swallowed up by Stalin during World War II, and they'd never forgotten it. By 1990, they were organizing rallies, raising their old flags, and flat out declaring that they weren't part of the USSR anymore. Moscow, of course, said they were, but saying it didn't make it true. Elsewhere, other republics began grumbling. Ukraine, Georgia, Armenia, Kazakhstan. The whole map was dotted with movements demanding more autonomy. It wasn't just a family squabble anymore. It was like the family house was being sawed into 15 separate pieces. Economically, things were even worse. Shops were empty. Inflation was soaring. People joked that under capitalism you couldn't find happiness, but under communism you couldn't find toilet paper. Not exactly morale boosting. Then, in 1991, came the real drama, the August coup. A group of hardline communists in Moscow, who thought Gorbachev was being too soft, decided to overthrow him. They put him under house arrest at his vacation home and rolled tanks into the streets of Moscow. It looked like the bad old days were back. But here's where history threw in a twist. Instead of the people cowering, thousands poured into the streets to protest the coup. And out of nowhere, a rival figure stepped into the spotlight. Boris Yeltsin, the president of the Russian Republic, which was technically inside the USSR at the time. Yeltsin climbed on top of a tank, gave a defiant speech, and basically positioned himself as the defender of democracy against the old communists. The image went global. Yeltsin standing tall, the coup leaders looking weak, and Gorbachev suddenly seeming irrelevant. Within days, the coup collapsed, but the damage was done. The Soviet Union's last threads had snapped. One by one, the republics declared independence. Ukraine voted overwhelmingly to leave. The Baltic states refused to come back. Even Russia, the core of the empire, was now following Yeltsin's lead rather than Gorbachev's. By December 1991, the end came officially. Leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus signed an agreement dissolving the USSR and replacing it with a loose commonwealth of independent states. Gorbachev, left with nothing to govern, resigned. The red Soviet flag was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time, replaced with the Russian tricolor. Just like that, the Cold War was over. No big battles, no final showdown, just exhaustion, reform gone too far, and a superpower that collapsed under its own weight. The United States, of course, declared victory. The evil empire had fallen, capitalism had triumphed, and for a moment it seemed that the world might be entering a new era of peace. Spoiler, the 1990s and beyond had plenty of problems of their own. But at least the threat of a global nuclear standoff eased for a while. And so, after nearly half a century of shadow boxing, proxy wars, ideological rants, and nuclear paranoia, the Cold War ended not with a bang, but with a sigh. A very tired sigh. So, if you're still awake, congratulations! You just listened to the entire Cold War explained in a calm, sleepy glide. From Berlin to Cuba, from Vietnam to Afghanistan, from Reagan's Star Wars to Gorbachev's resignation, it's all there. And that's the beauty of history told for bedtime. It reminds us that even the tensest standoffs, the biggest rivalries, eventually fade into the background. Dim the lights a little more, sink into the pillows, and drift off knowing that the scariest war of the 20th century ended without the world blowing up.
So, the Soviet Union was gone. Vanished. One day you had a giant superpower covering a sixth of the Earth. The next, you had 15 separate countries, all trying to figure out how to pay the bills and run themselves. It was like a giant empire had turned into a very messy yard sale overnight. For the United States, this was the "we won" moment. Politicians declared the U.S. the world's only superpower. Francis Fukuyama even wrote that history itself might be over, as if liberal democracy had finally settled the question of how humanity was supposed to organize itself. Spoiler, history did not end. It's still very much around, sometimes annoyingly so. NATO, the military alliance that had existed to counter the Soviet threat, suddenly had no Soviet Union to counter. Instead of disbanding, it expanded. Former Warsaw Pact countries like Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic eagerly signed up. Later, even the Baltic states joined. For them, it wasn't just paperwork, it was insurance. After decades of being stuck under Moscow's thumb, they wanted guarantees that it wouldn't happen again. Russia, meanwhile, stumbled into the 1990s with all the grace of someone trying to walk home after 3 nights without sleep. The economy collapsed, inflation skyrocketed, and millions of people who had once had jobs and state benefits suddenly found themselves in chaos. Factories shut down, pensions evaporated, and oligarchs, yes, those guys, rose out of the rubble, buying up industries for pocket change and becoming billionaires. Boris Yeltsin, who had looked like a hero standing on that tank in 1991, now had to actually run the country. It didn't go smoothly. His leadership style could generously be described as erratic. Let's just say the image of him drunkenly conducting a military band in public wasn't helping Russia's sense of stability. Meanwhile, the U.S. enjoyed what it called the unipolar moment. No more superpower rival, no more arms race. Washington had a free hand to throw its weight around, whether in the Middle East, the Balkans, or elsewhere. But lurking under the surface was the simple fact: Russia might be down, but it wasn't gone. Inside Russia, resentment simmered. NATO expanding eastward felt like betrayal. Economic reforms backed by Western advisors often made life worse for ordinary Russians. And while the Soviet Union had collapsed, the nuclear arsenal hadn't disappeared. Russia still had thousands of warheads, which meant nobody could entirely ignore them. As the 1990s turned into the 2000s, a new face arrived in Moscow: Vladimir Putin. Quiet, calculated, and determined to rebuild Russian power. But that's already nudging into a different era, post-Cold War, post-Soviet, but still shaped by everything that came before. And here's the quiet irony. The Cold War ended without the mushroom clouds everyone feared, but its fingerprints are still everywhere. In NATO borders, in Russian politics, in the nuclear arsenals that still exist, tucked away in silos. Even in cultural habits, spy movies, Red Scare paranoia, and all those endless documentaries with grainy footage of Khrushchev banging his shoe at the UN. So while 1991 gave us a clean, official, the end moment, it was really more like a chapter break. The Cold War was over, yes, but the story of how the US and Russia glare at each other across the chessboard, that kept going, just with fewer hammers and sickles and more awkward summits. And for our sleepy purposes tonight, that's the gentle landing point. The Cold War, born in 1945, stretched through proxy wars, nuclear threats, and space races, finally faded in 1991. What followed was uncertainty, awkward adjustments, and a lingering hangover that still hasn't quite gone away. So now, as you close your eyes, you can think of the Cold War not as a single war that ended, but as a very long, very tense argument that finally ran out of energy. The shouting stopped, the walls came down, the flags changed, and humanity quietly shuffled into its next messy chapter. And so here we are, at the end of a very long, very cold story. We began in the rubble of World War II, when two exhausted allies looked at each other and realized they didn't trust each other at all. We watched as their friendship turned to rivalry, then paranoia, then decades of shadowboxing across the world. We floated past the early years, Truman, Stalin, Berlin split like an uneasy cake. We drifted through Cuba, where missiles nearly tipped everything over the edge. We glided over jungles in Vietnam, deserts in Afghanistan, and even into outer space, where astronauts and cosmonauts raced for bragging rights. We sighed through détente, that brief pause where everyone pretended to be reasonable. Then we felt the frost return with Reagan and Star Wars. And finally, we saw the cracks open under Gorbachev. By the time the Berlin Wall fell, the ending was written. By 1991, the red flag was lowered and the Cold War quietly slipped away. What's left, when you pull back from the details, is something strangely human. The Cold War wasn't just about tanks and missiles and speeches. It was about fear. Fear of being weaker, fear of losing, fear of annihilation. But it was also about pride, nations puffing themselves up, showing off their rockets, their ideologies, their athletes, their chess champions, even their ballet dancers. Because if you can't outbomb your rival, you might as well outdance them. And the strangest part? The whole thing ended not with explosions, but with exhaustion. The Soviet Union simply ran out of breath. The U.S. declared victory, but really it was more like winning by default when your opponent quits the game. The nuclear arsenals stayed locked away, the troops came home, and the world exhaled, quietly, cautiously. Tonight, as you let the story fade, you might think about how fragile that balance really was. For nearly half a century, the fate of the planet dangled on decisions made by a handful of men in suits staring at buttons they prayed they'd never press. And yet, somehow, through luck, diplomacy, and sheer human stubbornness, we got through it. The Cold War is gone now, but its echoes remain in politics, in culture, in the maps of Europe, even in the quiet, uneasy way Russia and the West still look at each other across the table. History doesn't just stop, it lingers, it drifts, like a faint hum in the background.
and that's where we'll leave it. Close your eyes. Let the Cold War settle into the past, where it belongs. No mushroom clouds, no midnight alerts, no walls dividing families. Just the memory of a long frost that finally melted.
The Cold War is technically over. The red flags are folded away. The Berlin Wall is in tourist shops as keychains, and the old Soviet Union is now a collection of independent states trying to write their own futures. But endings are rarely neat. They tend to leak into the next chapter, leaving traces like ink stains. Think about the technology. The Cold War was supposed to give us nuclear Armageddon. Instead, it also gave us satellites, GPS, computers that eventually shrank into the phones on our nightstands. Even the Internet, in its earliest form, was a Cold War precaution, designed to keep communication alive in case of nuclear attack. So the same paranoia that kept people awake at night also made it possible for us to scroll cat videos before bed. Think about culture. Hollywood built entire genres out of the Cold War. Spy thrillers, alien invasion movies that were really metaphors for communism. Even James Bond suavely out-drinking his Soviet counterparts. On the other side, Soviet propaganda painted the West as decadent, greedy, and silly. Both sides spent years exaggerating the flaws of the other, like feuding siblings trying to convince the neighbors who was more respectable. And think about memory. For people who lived through it, the Cold War was constant background noise. Air raid drills in American schools, ration lines in Soviet cities, maps divided into neat blocks of red and blue. Generations grew up expecting the worst and yet learning to live with it. Because human beings are remarkably good at turning fear into routine. Now, decades later, there's a strange calm in looking back. The threats were enormous, the rhetoric was loud, but in the end, the world kept spinning. No mushroom clouds, no total collapse of civilization, just a long frost thawed slowly into something else. And maybe that's the ultimate sleepy thought tonight. History is rarely about grand finales. It's about slow changes, worn-down systems, leaders aging, economies sputtering, people quietly wanting something better. The Cold War didn't explode. It simply ran out of energy. So if you're still listening, let that idea settle in your mind, that sometimes the scariest rivalries end not in fire, but in silence. The Cold War has become history, and you, comfortably lying here, get to drift to sleep knowing you live on the other side of it.